Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the DEI Forum. My name is Lauren Steedley, and I serve as Vice President for the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to welcome you all to this very exciting session and installment of the DEI Forum. Today, we're going to have a great conversation on inclusive culture. Very excited about our panelists, very excited about our moderator who's going to be leading the discussion today. But before we pivot into the discussion, I would like to first thank our sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield Tennessee, who supported us throughout this series. We're very excited to continue to partner with them. This particular year has been fantastic with regards to content that we've tried to do through DEI Forum. And the purpose of this has largely been to inform individuals and organizations, leaders, managers who are engaged in this very, very important topic. And the intent here is just to provide knowledge, expand information to those organizations who are dealing with dynamics associated with both diversity and inclusion in both Chattanooga and that of Hamilton County. Having briefly touched on the purpose of why we're here and touched on a little bit more about this conversation and the topic of inclusive culture, I'd like to take a quick second just to introduce today's moderator, and then I'll hand it over to her. Let me start by just saying that Stacy Lightfoot joined the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga this year as the institution's first Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Engagement. In this role, she serves as a catalyst for foster a more inclusive campus community and provides strategic leadership for diversity and inclusive initiatives. Stacy participated in the Leadership Tennessee in 2019 and Harvard Business School's Young American Leaders Program in 2017. She earned a BA in Communications from DePaul University and an MA degree in International Service from the University of Roehampton in London, England. Having shared a little bit of Stacy's background, I wanted to hand it off to her. We're very excited to have her here today. Thank you very much for being here, Stacy.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Welcome to this Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Forum on Inclusive Culture. I am thrilled to be your moderator today and facilitate an energizing conversation with two of my favorite people, very dynamic and involved, committed community leaders. But before I get started, I want you all to know that you can drop your questions, not in the chat, but we want you to use the Q&A feature. So Lauren Steedley will manage the Q&A feature. The chat function has been disabled, but we do want this to be interactive. He will manage the questions as they come in. There are moments we'll be able to address your questions in real time, and then we will get to some of those questions at the very end. But we do welcome you to today, and I want Dwayne and Miles to introduce themselves. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, stating their titles and their place of work.
Thank you, Stacy. I'll go first. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dwayne Marshall. I serve as the Vice President of Community Investment at the Community Foundation of Greater Chattanooga.
And good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. My name is Miles Huff. I serve as Advocacy and Development Administrator for Cempa Community Care.
Thank you so much. The pressure is on. I've heard that nearly 200 people have signed up for this webinar, and that not only warms my heart, but it tells me what folks are hungry to learn and hungry to hear. So I don't take for granted that you two have taken time out of your days to just explain and provide some insight and feedback on what inclusivity means and what being inclusive means. But we know that it means different things to different companies. Like what it means and how it comes to life varies from one company to the next, depending on the needs of the company and its people. So for example, for one company, it may be unconscious bias training, right? And for other companies and institutions, it may mean hiring and retaining more diverse employees. And we know, and we've seen this trend in Chattanooga, that companies and institutions are hiring chief diversity officers or, folks with similar titles to wake up every day thinking about this. So tell us the businesses and organizations that are getting it right when it comes to inclusive culture, inclusion, DEI, whether it be locally, regionally, or nationally. What have you seen these organizations doing to promote and advance inclusivity in the workplace?
Great question, Stacy. several companies locally, regionally, and nationally, I think are on the right path. I think all of us are trying to get it right, but it's a constant challenge. It's a constant effort that's required to really be the most inclusive and diverse organization possible. As you mentioned earlier in your comments, several local companies, Cross Blue Shield, Unum, TVFCU, a host of others, even your role at UTC, several organizations have begun to identify a leader who is daily responsible for leading that work within their respective organization. I think that is paramount. I know that Lauren and the Chamber have been making inroads in bringing those collective diversity and inclusion officers together to share best practices and learnings at their respective institutions. So I think that's the key element that I've seen organizations. And then Forbes and Fortune do an annual survey where they rank companies that are making progress and inroads around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's several organizations that are getting it right, several organizations that are in relationship with each other, trying to get better and hold themselves accountable to be the best inclusive organization possible. So I think there are a lot of great local examples.
Thank you, Dwayne. Miles, do you have a response to that?
Oh, it's hard to add on to, Dwayne. That was such a good list. I would echo everything that Dwayne said. I would also mention locally, companies like EPB and even TVA, which I think is one of the unusual suspects in the diversity space, but the way that they've approached it has been really powerful. They have some of the strongest employee resource groups in our area. I think also we would be remiss not to mention some of our social sector partners in Chattanooga. We know that we have a really robust nonprofit community. And so Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Children's Advocacy Center, others, shamelessly throwing out Cempa Community Care, obviously, but it's important, Stacy, I think, to also think through not only those big hitters and those ones that are at the forefront of DEI work, but those smaller organizations that are making big strides for the size of their organization as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so some of these efforts are really good starting points, but we know that research states that creating a culture is a critical step on this journey. And I want to say this again, DEI work is not a sprint. It is a marathon. It is a journey. I think the spirit behind doing DEI work and doing it well is this notion and this thinking that it is a mindset and a framework, right? And thinking about the culture of our institutions and our organizations, embracing these unique ideas that come to the table, these unique and various and diverse perspectives and experiences and people. So I want us to talk about belonging, Miles and Dwayne, this notion of belongingness, right? And this sense of how belongingness is critical to satisfaction, to engagement, employee engagement, to happiness, to our physical and mental beings. And we also know that this is where companies are struggling, where institutions are losing momentum because they just don't understand how to do it. So can you talk about some of the challenges to building an inclusive workplace, and then maybe some strategies for mitigating those challenges?
I can start a little bit. So I would say, Stacy, we know, and I know that we're going to talk more about this, but talent is one of the biggest issues that every company, every industry is facing right now. And I think a lot of that is because of what you just mentioned, that sense of belongingness and engagement at the employee level. So I think when considering DEI work, one of the things that every organization should keep in mind is that in terms of incorporating DEI, that should absolutely be implemented and supported from the top down, right? So you have to have senior level leaders that are committed and bought into the idea, and that permeates throughout the organization. But on the other hand, you have to start at the individual contributor and grassroots level to build that buy-in and get ideas on what that looks like for your organization. So what works for a large Fortune 500 company is not necessarily going to work for a smaller organization or a privately held company. And so getting buy-in and ideas on what your employees want to see and what they are feeling in that work environment, I think changes the game when you're trying to implement DEI across the organization.
Thank you, Miles.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Miles' perspective on that. I think the first thing in terms of assessing belongingness within an organization, it starts with the organization having intentional conversation as a whole, but also with individual employees. You know, how doing an assessment, if you will, do you currently feel a sense of belonging and welcoming? And then if not, how can that be improved and how can that be enhanced? I agree with Miles' comment that it starts at the senior level. And it also has to be a board commitment to that as well. And the senior management and the board needs to be reflective of having a culture and having a philosophy that is a sense of belonging. I think that a lot of successful companies in this space offer routine trainings, bring in thought leaders, promote conversations, whether those be at staff meetings or annual staff and board retreats or at quarterly board meetings, where you routinely are bringing that conversation up in an effort to build that belongingness muscle, if you will. It doesn't happen overnight, so you have to have intentional opportunities to have those conversations and to be trained and educated as an organization on how you can get better at it. But I think a big way to do that is for an organization to do an internal audit. And the best way to do that is by having those individual conversations and maybe even conducting a staff survey to assess where you currently are and ways in which you can improve.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Miles and Dwayne, you all bring up some really good points. And we are talking about belongingness in terms of what institutions, companies, and organizations can do for their employees. But I've also been in conversations with other city leaders, thought leaders, about the responsibility of a community to be part of that as well. It's hard to get people to move to Chattanooga because some people don't necessarily see or feel community, or they have to work a little harder to find that. So can you talk about in the various spaces that you've been, either currently as you're working and you're talking with folks? Lauren, I know you are new to this city, but the importance of the city embracing this responsibility as well, and the benefits to a city coming together to do this.
Sure, I can start there. First thing I think is that in order for a city to be a welcoming city, we have to accept that it's not solely city officials' responsibility. It's all of our responsibility as citizens within this community. And it has to be a joint effort between the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic sector. All of us have a role to play. I think all too often, whether it's an individual organization, we place too much of that responsibility on a chosen few when it should be all of us working to do that. Lauren and the Chamber and us at the Community Foundation have been making some inroads this year in bringing a collective, diverse conversation table and to discuss ways in which we can work together collaboratively to promote a more equitable, a more inclusive Chattanooga. So I think what it starts with is our city feeling as if it has the support of all of the sectors in the community, helping them motivate and move that way. I think another way to do that is better educating the broader community about when we are more inclusive and more equitable, we all win. It's been proven that the most diverse communities have the best outcomes, not only in terms of economic development, but also the overall health and wellness of their citizenry. It's proven time and time again. So I think one of the ways in which we promote it is making sure that we share all of the fact that all of us are responsible and accountable to create that type of community, and also showing the benefits that we get by doing so.
That's great. So engaging in DEI work is the right thing to do. But the reality is the DEI work ultimately is about the business case for organizations and companies. Dwayne, you mentioned it, like not even the business case for companies, only companies, but how diversity positively impacts an entire city and a community in terms of positive outcomes. And we also know that organizations and businesses lose financially when their workforce lacks diversity, regardless of what the industry is. So talk about the imperative, right? Talk about the business imperative, the business case, and the businesses to benefits and companies that focus on inclusion?
I can start and then Dwayne let you add in. I mean, I think Stacy, you're exactly right that too often DEI work is seen as something that's politically charged or other things, but there is a business case for this work. And we see that in our own footprint here in Chattanooga. You know, we do have challenges to attracting talent and businesses to an area like Chattanooga because of the lack of diversity oftentimes. And so not only are our current employers going to see the benefits of talent retention on increased financial performance based on employee engagement and satisfaction and all of those things, and investor relations. To Dwayne's point, from an economic development perspective, you know, when we're looking as a chamber and as a community to attract new employers and new people to our area, not having DEI practices in place is a huge hurdle that we would have to look at. And I think, you know, to Dwayne's point, too often we think that DEI work is the responsibility of DEI professionals, and that is not solely the case. We see it in Chattanooga, and you know, currently Mayor Kelly has a Chief Equity Officer position posted, and we see the work that Chattanooga Tourism Company and River City Company and others are doing to cross those sectors and to make Chattanooga a place where anyone can come and find a community and feel that belonging. So it isn't just a nice to have. There truly is financial benefit when we engage in this work, not only for our employers, but from a tourism perspective and all the other aspects of trying to get people into our community.
Dwayne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to build on the business imperative and the business case for it. You know, there are regions around the country that are actively and consistently having this conversation every single day, because those regions that are on the right path in terms of diversity and inclusion are going to attract the best employers to their region, the best talent to their region. And since I've gotten here, it's always been a goal of Chattanooga, I consistently hear it, of wanting to be the best place to live in the South and in the country. The way that we ensure that happens is by positioning ourselves to attract the right talent and to attract the right companies for that talent to be supported and employed. So there's a case for us to actively ensure that the employees that we have here and the employers that we want to be attracted to come here, they feel like they have the talent and they have the culture where their people will be supported and be able to reach their full potential. So it's a huge, huge paramount importance for us to continue on the right path around this conversation around inclusion.
So this is a difficult topic. People, you know, folks have to define what diversity means in their respective spaces, right? Like, to me, diversity is everything that makes us different. The way that we think, where we're from, how we sound, our religion, our ethnic backgrounds, like all of these dimensions, right? But what's really hard for us to talk about is the racial implications when we start talking about DEI and the importance of racial equity. Dwayne, I know the Community Foundation has made racial equity one of its focuses. And I would love for you to unpack and just take us through briefly what that process has been to you and the why behind that particular focus for the Community Foundation. I think it's important for our participants in our audience to hear that. Although this isn't about racial equity, I think it is, I'd be remiss not to at least lift up what you all have done in this space.
Sure. So the Community Foundation has been having an ongoing conversation with key stakeholders in the community, as well as key leaders in the community. And this began several years ago, asking what are some of the most pressing issues facing the current and future of Chattanooga and Hamilton County. And as a result of those conversations, it repeatedly came up that there was limited upward mobility for families that were experiencing multi-generational poverty. And as we began to unpack that conversation and assess data, it became incredibly clear that the communities that were mostly facing economic hardship and generational poverty were communities of color. So as a result of that conversation and talking to various regional and thought leaders, the Community Foundation committed to an approach around having a commitment towards addressing racial equity. The Community Foundation began that journey by also having and offering trainings such as the Racial Equity Institute, which has been offered routinely in the community here in Chattanooga, for us to better understand the historical reasons why some of the inequities exist within our community, so that we can all have a base level understanding around why those challenges exist, but also going deeper to some of the nuances that play out in Chattanooga and Hamilton County as well. Where we currently are is we're currently having conversations with our community and with other local and at times regional partners to specifically define our approach. One of the ways in which we want to do this work is, again, this is very hard, complicated, complex generational work. We can't do it alone as an institution. So several local allies, such as the Chattanooga Chamber of Commerce, the Urban League of Greater Chattanooga, the City of Chattanooga, several other allies have been working closely with us to form an action table where we will be able to, in the not so distant future, set some clear and measurable goals of how we want to address and tackle racial equity within our community. But we're trying to take a holistic approach and a collaborative approach, because this work is too important for one institution to lead it alone. It has to be a rallying cry for all of us to do it and do it well. So that's kind of been our journey, is talking directly to community that has validated that this is an important issue for us to face for the future of our city. But then in knowing that, bringing other partners and allies, individual and institutional partners, to the conversation and to the table for us to work on it together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dwayne, and hats off to Megan Jones, hats off to all of the staff at the Community Foundation for tackling this very hard work. Not very many people are addressing it the ways that the Community Foundation is, and it can be a daunting task to take on. But if not you, who? And if not now, when? Miles, I'm going to go over to you and just want you to, Dwayne mentioned earlier in the conversation about the benefits of a community, a more diverse community, and addressing and closing opportunity gaps and closing kind of disparity gaps. I know you work in Cempa community care. Can you connect at all what some of the racial implications are of doing this work in the healthcare space and with Cempa, and then what Cempa is doing to address some of those disparities?
Certainly, Stacy, and thank you for that question. So I would say that we know here at Cempa, we know that communities of color have been disproportionately affected by various types of diseases and health disparities for a long time. Cempa began as an HIV and AIDS awareness organization, and even then, there were just huge differences in the way that HIV and AIDS impacted communities of color. But COVID obviously brought to light that during the pandemic that we are still currently experiencing, for various reasons, the Latinx and Black communities were disproportionately affected and impacted by COVID-19. And a lot of that goes back to what Dwayne was mentioning, is a lack of resources and a lack of awareness that have been in place systemically for hundreds of years. And so much of the work that we do at Cempa, now that we focus not just solely on community health, but primarily on community health, is looking at those long-term health disparities and why they exist and how we can get into those communities to raise awareness on those underlying issues. So we know at Cempa that if we can get into those communities with our outreach work, and we're very active in trying to do that with many of the partners that Dwayne mentioned, and raise awareness on kind of those key health indicators, BMI, cholesterol, lots of things that disproportionately affect those communities. In the event that we, heaven forbid, are in another COVID-19 situation in the future, if we're tackling that now and fighting that now and removing barriers to access for primary care and health awareness in those communities, that's going to move the needle in the long term. And so we lived in COVID world for a long time, and we were a big part of vaccines and testing, but we know that the long-term goal is to reduce those health disparities in the long term so that we're moving the needle and changing things for generations.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Cempa. Thank you, Community Foundation. So let's talk about what steps businesses can take to do this work and to do it well. So what are some of the first steps a business institution should consider when deciding to embark on their DEI journey?
I think the first thing that a company should do is commit. And I'm going to say commit at the highest level and commit at every realm and level of the organization. This is generational, long-term work. This is not something that is going to be accomplished and done in a quarter or in a year. This is going to be something that an institution is going to have to fully embed into the lifeblood of its organization. So they have to commit. Senior leadership and boards have to also measure themselves annually, ideally, in terms of how they are making progress towards diversity and inclusion. I've seen some really thoughtful first-class organizations embed a measurable around inclusiveness in the annual report of their senior staff, as well as their junior staff. So how are you individually within that organization showing up to promote a more inclusive culture, to promote a more inclusive workplace, and also be a shining example around inclusiveness throughout your sector, so your organization can be viewed as a inclusiveness thought leader, if you will. I think those are some of the things that can be done. Also, an internal audit, so looking at the organization, the first place I think a company can start is, where are we currently? And you can't do that without having some type of survey or analysis or an audit of your staff and of your board that assess where you are. And then that's going to help give you a baseline of what you need to grow and expand to. And then last, but definitely not least, in addition to it being complicated and long-term, Stacy and Miles, I know you both know, it can oftentimes feel overwhelming. And if it does, the way that you tackle that is identify a thought leader or an expert or a consultant to work alongside your organization so that you don't feel as if you have to tackle it alone. I think a consultant or an advisor, if you will, can play an incredible, powerful role in helping you be on that journey. And then last but not least, study and review. I'm willing to bet that there are probably other organizations that you admire locally or nationally that are in your field or otherwise that may have a developing roadmap on how your organization can start. So I think those are some of the things that I would recommend. Commit for the long term, have some type of measurable or key indicators on how you are individually and institutionally making progress, and then identify a thought leader, partner, or consultant to work alongside you.
Understood. And Miles, what can you add to that?
Not a lot. I mean, that was Dwayne, that was great. I would say one thing that I would also encourage any organization to think about, Stacy, is tying all of those things, excuse me, that Dwayne said back into your performance indicators. That's scary, and setting metrics and goals around that you know that you're going to be held accountable to can be intimidating. But I think that if you want to really, really commit, like Dwayne was saying, that it needs to be tied to performance, and you need to look at how, as an organization, you're holding yourself accountable for the work. It's one thing to hire a chief diversity or equity officer, and that's amazing, and that's a step in the right direction. But if there's absolutely no sort of parameters around what success looks like within that, you need to be building that out in the long term.
That's great. I mean, I don't think I could have said it any better. I heard collecting data, right? And keep on collecting it, making sure that you understand where the organization is, so you know where the organization needs to go, and determining and identifying with key leadership and stakeholders what those meaningful, measurable outcomes and objectives need to be. Also, Dwayne, I heard you talk about leaders needing to walk the walk and championing DEI and the DEI journey of an organization and an institution at every level. It is not the responsibility only of the chief diversity officer. It is not the responsibility of only the chief diversity officer to wake up thinking about this every day. There needs to be ownership, and I like saying ownership as opposed to buy-in, but ownership at every level of an organization, but especially at the top. As the journey and strategies and culture, right, is built at every level. I also want to talk about just specifics. You know, you talk about measuring, you know, what matters gets measured. What should companies think about in terms of success? Like, what could success look like for companies? And it could be what success has looked like for your organization and institution. And what are you hearing around best practices in terms of success and growth in the DEI space for companies?
Sure. So I think success begins with thinking about small victories, things that you can really put in place, hopefully within a relatively short period of time, that will ensure that you're making movement, if you will. So I think part of that is involving looking at your staff and your board representation, looking and seeing, hey, are we where we want to be? And if not, putting in some definitive goals on how to get there. How do I set some goals in terms of making my staff more representative of my community, my board as well? Unless you own that and set a goal for that, it will not get done. So you have to set a goal and a measuring stick for yourself to get there. Doing some policy and procedures review, doing an assessment of your current policies and seeing, hey, are there some gaps or some holes that we need to fill to ensure that we have a more inclusive workplace and we have a more diversified atmosphere? Again, doing a policy and procedure review, I think would be very helpful. And then if there is a trade association for your industry, which I'm almost willing to bet that there is, doing some research to see who are some of the best in class companies around diversity and inclusion within my field. What have they successfully done? Who can I learn from and reach out to? Who can be a thought partner to help my company and organization get started? I think those are some things. And then last but not least, I think it's always important to talk to your colleagues internally, because it's one thing for senior leadership to have some thoughts and ideas, but if you truly want to create the ideal inclusive workplace, everybody needs to have a voice in that conversation. So I think you can begin within to help you identify what is the best practice, because the best practice for another organization may not be the best practice for you based on your size and other factors. So I think you have to ask your local employees as well.
I am seeing some questions in the chat grow. I do have a few more questions, but I do want to pause. We're halfway to the finish line on this webinar, but wanted to give some space and some time to Lauren to address some of the questions in the chat.
You know, I'm trying to determine, I can't see the.
Oh, the chat or Q&A, I'm sorry, not the chat feature, but the Q&A feature.
Hold on. I don't see it.
So I have them here. I'll start. Derek Young asked, do you feel that D&I efforts in Chattanooga or across the region are being tackled as independent strategies, or are they part of a larger kind of strategic imperative?
I can start. And hey, Derek, I know Derek well, but so Derek, I think I would say DEI work began as very much an independent approach. It was seen as sort of a siloed department or effort that, this is, Stacy, like we've talked about, this is this person's responsibility and this is their wheelhouse and this lives here. I think the shift that we're seeing now, which is great nationally, regionally, and even locally, is that the DEI conversation is becoming a part of a larger strategy around ESG work, corporate social responsibility, talent, and it's merging. And I think that it should. I think that DEI work, if it's siloed and it lives alone in its own independent place, like Dwayne was saying, it's not going to permeate across the organization, and there's not going to be accountability and partnership across various departments. So if corporate philanthropy is doing one thing, but they're not talking to DEI and they're not looking at how they're engaging the community in that way, then there's going to be a miss. And so I think that the trend that I've seen is that it is shifting to become a kind of cross-sectional approach to that strategy.
So Bob Colkeen asks, how does he get involved with training that you spoke about, Dwayne? He enrolled in a national public media DEI training, but would love to really engage local support. So do you have any ideas or suggestions to Bob about ways that he can engage locally?
Sure. So the training that I mentioned earlier was a training offered by the Racial Equity Institute. It's a national organization based out of North Carolina, but they offer trainings all over the country. And the Urban League of Greater Chattanooga has been routinely offering that training to those in the community who want to be a part of it. They have a groundwater training, which sets a base foundation. And then there's a next phase, which is phase 1. And there's also a phase 2 to kind of have deeper conversations about issues around race and racial equity. I'm willing to bet that the Urban League's website probably has a schedule of future training offerings locally. So that would be where I would start.
Hey, Stacy, I'm finally in here. So I think I can take that off your hand a little bit. I think I have a next person here. It looks like an anonymous attendee. Do you feel that the more effective in some situations to approach DEI efforts is, in quotes, calling in way by showing what disparities there are first before calling out, in quotes, how those people holding privilege contribute to the system and how they contribute to those disparities?
I'll start. I think, yes, I think Dwayne has mentioned this several times, but I think before anyone's engaging in this work, it's very important to do an assessment of where you are as an organization. There may be problems that exist that as an organization you have no idea that are there, or there may be problems that you think exist that aren't issues. And I think that when we look specifically around various types of diversity, Stacy, like you mentioned, generational diversity, not only race and ethnicity, but LGBTQ plus communities and that sort of thing. A lot of those invisible diversity factors are really important to take into consideration. So establishing where you are and where your employees feel that you are and what their satisfaction is like is very important, I think, when you're trying to build this out, rather than just assuming this is what exists and this is what our problems are and we're going to put this in place, because you might be missing the mark completely.
Yeah.
And I'd love to offer some feedback to this question. There is, this resonates with me, calling in versus calling out, and what data can do and how data can play a role into calling people in, because then the data doesn't become about 1 or 2 or 3 individuals. You use that data to inform and to guide strategies, and you call in and lean into people who can help you solve or mitigate or address some of the challenges or issues or data, and benchmark your goals based on data. So this isn't about people holding privilege. This really is about people who have the power and the influence to make decisions and really to drive and championing change in the ways that your data reflect and in the ways that you want and in the direction you want your organization to go. And I know when we hear the word privilege, folks start to cringe, because there are a lot of people who hold privilege in organizations. Leaders have privilege. We all have privilege in some kind of way, and it is how you use your influence, how you use your passion, your vision to drive and to inform the direction of your organization by using data, staff surveys, employee surveys, hiring practice data, hiring data. If you want to grow in grow the diversity of your cross-sector employees, well, you got to know where you are. You got to know who's not employed at your institution, and you have to know how those employees at your institution or organization, how they feel, and how satisfied they are, and how engaged they are. So I love that question, and it's really changing the calling in versus calling out, but using this data to call people into a conversation and call people in to solutions.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And if I can just add to that, Lauren, very briefly, I think calling out leads to exclusion. calling in leads to inclusion. I know very few scenarios where calling out actually has worked to make things better.
Right.
When you talk about calling in, I think Stacy and Miles framed it perfectly. When you can showcase through data, through research and information, how we're leaving opportunity on the table, and we're preventing our individual and institutional allies from being at their best by not being as inclusive and not capturing the voice and perspectives of everyone in the community, how it's causing us to leave opportunity on the table regionally. I think then people get excited about that, because I think all of us want to be in our best. And when you put that information forth, everybody then wants to be a part of the process to go in the direction that we want to go. Calling out never works.
Gotcha. I got one more here I want to pass on to you guys. Anonymous attendee. I work at a business that's not on a public transit line. Therefore, there are some significant economic hurdles we face in recruiting diversity. How do we reconcile the issues we are facing internally with issues that are outside of our control?
That's a great question.
Transportation's always a tough one. I think this isn't a direct answer necessarily, but I think Dwayne had mentioned this and I had as well. That's one of the reasons why DEI work is not the sole responsibility of one person or one organization. If we want to see issues like this be tackled, that's why you get engaged with your city and county leadership. That's why we need cross-sector partnerships between public transit lines and the social sector and employers, and figuring out what those barriers are. I think equity and that word is a buzzword, but equity to me, the biggest part of that is actively removing barriers to success. That includes transportation and childcare and education and training and all of those things. But again, that's not one solution. So if you want to change that, it's not just your organization. You need to be advocating and making your voice heard, especially in the political realm, to make sure that those barriers are removed.
So there are a few more questions in the Q&A. I have another question to ask that is very similar to Jocelyn, who talks about how difficult it is to broach this subject, and how do you do it? How can organizations, what advice can you give to organizations that have trepidation around starting conversations, doing this work? And so because they are afraid to tackle it and afraid to talk about it, they remain stagnant. So question is, how do you navigate, right, this space or organization where DEI is not the norm of conversations? How do you bring it up and broach it?
Dwayne, you want to go first? You want me to?
I'll let you go first. I'll follow you.
I think we've mentioned a lot of things. I think, Stacy, what I would say is start small. That for every organization, that's going to look different. I think focus groups and employee conversations are a great way to begin. Creating those focus groups, whether that be through employee resource groups or however you want to approach it, creating a safe space for people to have those open conversations, which includes support from leadership within the organization, is a great way to start. And really, again, setting goals that make sense for your organization. For a small organization, that's not going to look like implementing huge strategies and hiring a chief equity officer. It might just mean, like Dwayne has mentioned, examining some of those systemic and root level issues, such as unconscious bias and systemic racism, and just doing trainings and offering those to your employees. But starting small is going to be key if you want to be successful in the long term.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miles.
And if I can add to Miles's comments, great job, Miles. In terms of also starting small and having that internal conversation around something that is hard, as discussing issues such as diversity, inclusion, equity, and race. What I've seen some companies do is develop an internal team, a small intimate team, where there's one representative from each division or department within the organization. So again, these are heavy, hard conversations that should not be led by one individual. It requires a team approach. So in an effort to lean into that conversation, I think one thing that can work is assembling a small intimate team of 4 or 5 people who will help design a conversation that the entire organization can have together. And they then lean into that circle of trust that will hopefully, that's the foundation of this whole conversation. There has to be a strong level of trust within the organization and a commitment to transparency, so that nobody is judged by their response or the answers, but it's truly an open, safe space environment. But developing an internal team to where those issues and concerns or desired conversation questions that people want to have, there's a representative from each department or division is helping to champion that, so that you can design a conversation where everybody feels as if their voice is heard in a format and a fashion that everybody is comfortable.
Sorry, real quick, last thing. I will just say, Dwayne, something that Dwayne has said I think is key throughout all of this. Don't be afraid to bring in an external expert. I think there's often issues when you're starting this type of work. If you have opportunities for growth in this area in your organization that you aren't aware of, if you don't bring in an external expert, some of those may not come to light. And so don't be afraid to lean on someone outside of the organization that may be able to facilitate conversations differently or create safe spaces in a way that you may not think of. It's like when you were a kid and your parents told you one thing and you knew it and right, like it sounds good, but then your cool aunt says it and then all of a sudden it makes sense. So it's like, consider that outside voice and how that might be perceived by your internal employees.
Thank you. There was a question about how to recruit diversity, how to recruit more diverse workforce, and I can tackle this in a couple of lines. We don't think about the words that we use in job ads and how revising job ads could be the key to helping get more folks to apply. We use a lot of gender coded words like aggressive and dominant. And so there are tools that you can use to help you uncode or gender decode words. Also, some of the requirements that are listed on job descriptions aren't even necessary or essential for the job. There are a lot of men that apply for jobs they're not qualified for, and statistics have shown that while women wait to make sure they are closely aligned 100%, right, in order for them to apply. And so if you want to increase your gender diversity, you may want to look at job ads as well in the language. Also, like showcasing what diversity means and looks like in your organization using external communications, for example. It's going to be hard for folks to feel like they are included if they don't see a lot of diversity on websites or in brochures or in other collateral that you may use with the company. And there are lots more ways that companies can think about diversifying their workforce and recruiting a more diverse workforce as well. And also, where are folks recruiting? Are we using job boards aimed at minoritized groups? And there are certain job boards that folks can start to use even when you talk about autism, right? Like there's an autism job board and job boards for people with disabilities. And so I think we need to think creatively and out of the box to start posting jobs on some of these very diverse in these very diverse ways. And so much of that you can find by Googling as well.
I just wanted to chime in real quick because I am mindful of our time here. So we have some very good questions here, and unfortunately, I don't know if I think we have ample time to address these all, but one of the ones that stands out to me, it comes from excuse me, Bob, if I butcher your last name with a name like Steedley, I'm very sensitive. Bob, I think it's Culkin. It's a question about small businesses. With small companies, less than 20 employees, achieving DEI in the workplace is more of a challenge. Skill sets, budgets. Please share what you feel will help to recruit a more diverse workforce, given some of those limitations.
I can start. I think, Bob, that's a great question. I will say, I think one of the advantages that smaller organizations have is that you have the ability to be more nimble in your approach to this type of work. You don't have huge processes that you have to go through in order to make that change. And so I would encourage you to not see that as so much of a challenge, but as an opportunity. I think, Stacy, everything that you said is very true. How you are presenting your organization to the public on social media through your marketing and communications efforts has a huge impact on your ability to attract diverse talent. I mean, if you think that people aren't looking at your website and your Instagram and Facebook to see what people look like on there, is your website accessible for somebody who has maybe a visual impairment or, those types of things, I think that you would be remiss to think that that's not happening. And I think Dwayne mentioned this earlier, but long term, I mean, really, those policies and procedures internally that enforce and encourage inclusion, such as parental leave, do you only have parental leave for mothers that have babies versus surrogacy, paternal leave, foster care, those types of things? What does that look like? Are your insurance policies inclusive for people across a variety of generations? If you have a young startup, mainly millennials or Gen Z that are working there, is your insurance also going to be conducive to maybe a Gen Xer or a baby boomer that might want to work there? And what does that look like? So as a small organization, you have the ability to really, really shift things quickly and to do it without some of the hoops that larger organizations might have to jump through.
That you bring up a really good point, Miles. And I would say, Bob, ask your employees. Your employees are working for you. Nonprofit organizations don't have really robust budgets. And so that doesn't come as a shock and it's a surprise to your employees. So if you ask them what are some ways that could help allow them to feel better engaged and a better sense of belonging, I mean, you can get some of those answers from your employees. I just will tell a super quick story. We did this survey around best places to work at an organization that I lived, and someone really wanted to bring their dog to work. And that's what encouraged them or motivated them or excited them about coming to work, is the ability to bring their dog in one day a week or a couple of days a week. And so small organizations are a lot more nimble to change and modify policies and practices and procedures that could bolster and enhance that sense of belonging and inclusivity. Great job with that question, Miles. I know we have a few more minutes, Lauren. I'm going to pass it on to you to either facilitate a couple of more questions or close us out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stacy. I'm going to try to do this rapid fire. Okay, so I got like 3 great ones, but I'm going to start with Ella. I think it's Klingler. Again, don't want to butcher your last name, but the real quick question is, what tools are available for assessing my organization? And I know that earlier on, Dwayne talked a lot about research and how that's important. So can you guys just chime in real quickly on 1 or 2 things that stand out in terms of these tools that will be helpful for organizations seeking to do assessment in this DEI space?
You want to go ahead? You spoke to that earlier.
I think one of the things that you can do is most trade associations for your industry will have some type of assessment or tool that you can turn to and use just to do a quick assessment of your company. And then that's the other value of a consultant as well, or an advisor, is if you need one like that's uniquely designed for your organization, there are different firms out there who can help with that as well. And I know of one locally in particular that is doing that. So I can help with that offline too, if that's more helpful.
Okay. That's awesome. Well, guys, it's about 10:54 at this time. And I want to give everybody an opportunity to maybe have a comment in terms of closing comment. And I was going to close out, and I'm going off script on that a little bit. But I know that the richness of the conversation, for which I'm very appreciative to each of your contributions today. But I just wanted to go around and see if there were some closing thoughts.
My closing thought is, and first of all, I want to thank you, Lauren, and the Chamber for arranging this conversation, and a pleasure to be with you, Stacy, and Miles this morning as well. Is a reference to something that Stacy said in her opening comments, that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So this is something that we as a community, we with our respective organizations and us as individual leaders have to understand that this is a work and a pace that we're going to have to dedicate ourselves to over the course of our respective careers. It's not something that's going to be accomplished overnight. And it's not something that one individual is going to be able to solve for their respective organization, and definitely not for our community. So I want to encourage us to be committed to the learning journey and to the work, but also committed to how can I bring another ally or colleague along on this work? And also, how can I bring another institutional partner along in this work for the greater good of the entire region and community?
Thank you, Dwayne. Stacy?
So I'm reading this book called One Piece of Paper. It's by Mike Figliuolo. And it talks about these maxims and these statements, these emotionally charged statements that kind of drive our behavior. And this book talks about leading your thinking, leading your team. And one thing that he talks about is being bold and unafraid to do something different. I think the fear of DEI work is knowing that things may have to change.
Mm-hmm.
And change ain't that bad, y'all.
Right.
It feels uncomfortable, but the only place that we grow is outside of our comfort zone. That is the only place that we grow outside of our comfort zone as individuals, as companies. So, you know, just the one line that I want to leave with every leader that's on the call, every influencer, every decision maker that's on the call is be unafraid and unapologetic to change for the right ways, for the bottom line of your business, but also for the hearts and the minds of the people that work with you and that you impact and serve. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to facilitate this with some phenomenal people.
Thank you. Miles, real quick.
Oh, I have to follow those two. Yeah, I mean, I think everything they said. The only other thing that I would add, and we've mentioned this, is I do want to say thank you, Lauren, to you and Darian and Christy in the chamber for the work that you're doing. Because as we've mentioned, this is a business conversation. And this is something that's not going away. And it's not something that's just the right thing to do. But if we want to attract and retain businesses and talent in Chattanooga and Hamilton County, this conversation needs to continue. And it needs to continue to be facilitated by business leaders like the Chamber of Commerce and the people on this call. So I applaud you for the work that you're doing. And it's been an honor to be here. And I hope that 3 to 5 years from now, we're still having this conversation, but we're talking about all the amazing successes we've seen as a community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Miles. And thank you, Stacy. And thank you, Dwayne. And thank you, everyone who took the time to join us for this very timely conversation and very important topic. Again, my name is Lauren Steedley. I serve as Vice President for the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. And just by way of this closing comments, I just again want to thank Blue Cross Blue Shield for your phenomenal support throughout this series. We will continue to do efforts like this going into 2022. So keep posted and look out for some of these upcoming events. And just by way of just closing out, I'm mindful of the 2 minutes I have here. Internally, some of the things that we've sort of taken forward with regards to the Chamber of Commerce, Dwayne alluded to one of them, and that is the DEI Advisory Committee. We started that back in January with the express purpose of bringing stakeholders across various sectors together to discuss how best to go about sharing information, data. How do we make some of this impact that we see as necessary to expand and build on the economy here in Chattanooga? Also, we have a PEI peer group amongst some of our members here with the express purpose, again, educating, training, developing up, providing speakers with the understanding that here's a topic that is important to your organization. And as was stated earlier, you don't need to go alone. And also too, we're doing this and we understand it's methodical with regards to partners around spaces and places. And finally, internally, this is not something that's outward facing that we, the chamber, are doing. We're also looking internally. We're looking at our inclusive culture. We have a committee for which we are looking at and talking about some of the various components that we heard earlier today, looking at inclusive culture, looking at procurement, looking at policies and procedures that will best allow the organization to understand value and also, as an example, leverage some of the benefits of the DEI conversation. So just wanted to alert you guys to some of those things that are some of the work that's going on at your local chamber. Also, too, by way of just a last minute announcement, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to have their State of America. I think it's going to be on January the 11th. And I just wanted to alert you guys of that coming up, the U.S. Chambers State of America. Again, given that the passage of the recent infrastructure bill, some of the changes that are going on in the U.S. economy, again, that may be some information that organization will be very interested in. Having said that, I just cannot thank, again, each and every one of our panelists for being here today. The incredible content that you guys provided. I mean, I took so many notes, it was incredible. So I just want to thank you for your time. I just want to wish you, each and every one of you, a very happy holiday season. And again, if let's continue to stay in this conversation, continue to stay in this dialogue. And if I can do anything in this role and vice versa, please don't hesitate to let us know. You guys have a wonderful holiday season. Look forward to talking to you real soon. Take care.